The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of David's home office, casting golden streaks on the polished oak desk. It had been a long day at work, but he was looking forward to the evening. Melissa had promised a quiet dinner, just the two of them. For once, their hectic schedules aligned. David leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the family photo on the shelf. It was taken 3 years ago on their trip to Maui, back when life seemed simpler. His chest tightened. Lately, something had felt off. Melissa had been distracted, her laughter forced, her phone always angled away from his line of sight. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the pressures of her job at the marketing firm. But as he reached for the pile of mail on his desk, an envelope slipped out, a crumpled receipt poking from its edge. Curious, David unfolded the paper. His heart thudded. The receipt was from the Hyatt downtown, dated just 2 nights ago. 2 entrees, champagne, and dessert. Hardly the sort of thing Melissa would splurge on alone. David stared at the document, the room growing colder. Melissa had been home late that night, claiming she was wrapping up a project. He rose, pulling open her desk drawer. It felt wrong, invasive even, but his hands moved on their own. Amid the usual clutter of receipts and sticky notes, he found a leather-bound notebook. David hesitated, then opened it. "David!" exclaimed David fiercely, pointing at the notebook. "What is this?" Dr. Fisher was 10 years older. The first few pages were, ordinary meeting notes, a grocery list. Then, like a sudden storm, the words changed. "Can't wait for Thursday. I wish I could spend every night with you. XOXO J." His breath caught Narco. It hit him like a punch to the gut. The friendly banter at office parties, the subtle touches he'd dismissed as harmless. The signs had been there, but he'd ignored them. David sat heavily in his chair, the notebook clutched in his hands. He couldn't confront Melissa. Not yet. He needed time to think, to plan. He glanced at their wedding photo on the wall. Melissa beaming in her white dress, the future stretching wide before them. That future now seemed like a cruel joke. David's lips tightened. He wasn't the kind of man to lash out impulsively. No, he would act deliberately, calculatingly. He'd always been a man of strategy, whether in his career or personal life. This would be no different. Whether he won or lost, Clem didn't like the way things were handled. Still, with additions to the damage, his lips had turned even. For the next few hours, David combed through their shared accounts, tracking Melissa's spending. Late-night Ubers, hotel stays, charges at upscale restaurants. Each transaction painted a picture more damning than the last. By the time he closed his laptop, the sun had set, and a hard resolve had settled over him. Melissa had betrayed him, but she would not destroy him. Tomorrow, he would begin. This wasn't just about exposing her lies. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his life. Melissa didn't know it yet, but her world was about to collapse. And so the morning sunlight streamed into the kitchen as David stood by the counter, sipping his coffee. The house was quiet, its usual rhythm absent, as Melissa had left early for another meeting. David's mind buzzed with the remnants of last night's revelations. His pain, still raw, now simmered into a cold, calculated focus. He pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet he'd titled Reset Plan. Each tab reflected a piece of his strategy: financial, legal, personal. The betrayal had cut deep, but David wasn't the type to let himself bleed out. If Melissa thought she had outmaneuvered him, she was in for a shock. Flip could see Melissa's mental condition plummeting, and the return of her terror led to an early concert at the Greenway. It was Prune. He prepared himself for the right scene. He prepared Blue in the room. The first step was simple, yet devastating to cutting off her access to the resources she had taken for granted. David logged into their joint bank account and initiated the freezes. A few clicks and her credit cards were disabled. The savings account, where they'd pooled funds for years, was transferred to a separate account under his name. He paused for a moment, his finger hovering over the confirm button. Then he pressed it, sealing her financial isolation. Next, he turned his attention to the assets. Their shared car, a sleek white sedan Melissa had insisted they lease, was still under his name. By midday, he had arranged for its sale. The dealership would come to pick it up in 2 days. Melissa's phone bill and other expenses linked to his accounts were also slated for cancellation. By the time he was done, David sat back and exhaled. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his own agency. The years he had spent working overtime, building their life together, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. She had leveraged his trust and hard work to fund her deception. But David wasn't just aiming to punish. He wanted clarity. He opened a private browser and ordered a digital forensic kit. It was time to pull everything from Melissa's phone and laptop, emails, text messages, even deleted files. David would uncover the full scope of her betrayal, not for vengeance, but to ensure he wasn't blindsided. A knock at the door broke his concentration. It was George, a longtime friend and lawyer. "You weren't kidding when you said you needed my expertise," George said, stepping inside and glancing at the stack of documents on the kitchen table. "You need my help." David offered him coffee, and they settled in. He explained everything, the affair, the financial steps he'd taken, and his plans for a clean exit. George listened without interruption, his brow furrowed as he processed the situation. "You're doing the right thing by getting ahead of this," George said finally. "But there's one thing you need to consider. If she's been this calculated, she might already be building her own case against you. We need to make sure your side is airtight." Together, they drafted a list of actions: securing a forensic accountant to ensure all transactions were legitimate, contacting a mediator to discuss custody of their shared assets, and preparing documentation that would paint a clear picture of Melissa's misconduct. By early afternoon, David had made progress. He drafted a brief note and left it on the dining room table. "Melissa, I know. Take this weekend to figure things out with him. I'm done funding your double life. Best of luck." The simplicity of the note belied its impact. He imagined her returning home, her initial irritation at the missing car quickly turning into panic as she realized the extent of her newfound limitations. And in turn, as the day waned, David began clearing out the home office. The process was strangely therapeutic. He packed away old photos, framed memories that now felt like relics of a life that no longer existed. Yet he left a few on the shelves, not as a gesture of sentimentality, but as evidence, proof of what they had built and what she had torn apart. That evening, David sat in the same chair where he discovered the receipts that unraveled his world. His mind was calm, his resolve steely. Tomorrow would bring the fallout, the panic, the inevitable confrontation. But tonight, he allowed himself a single moment of peace. Melissa might have thought she could walk all over him, but David had no intention of being anyone's doormat. She had played her hand, and now it was his turn. Melissa arrived home earlier than usual, her heels clicking against the tiled entryway. She was carrying a shopping bag from a high-end boutique, her face bright with the afterglow of a pleasant day. David sat in the living room, his arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. The note he'd left on the dining table was gone, and Melissa clearly hadn't seen it yet. "Hey, you're home early," she said cheerfully, but her voice faltered as she noticed the tension in the air. "I didn't have much reason to stay late," David replied evenly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Ah, did you? I wonder if your long-winded approach contributed to that," David said thoughtfully. Her face darkened. Melissa hesitated, then put the bag on the kitchen counter. Is something wrong?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the glass of water on the coffee table, taking a deliberate sip. "I think you'd better check your wallet." Her brow furrowed in confusion. Melissa fished her purse off her shoulder and opened it. She pulled out her credit card and frowned, flipping it over as if the problem might lie on the back. She tried not to let the unease show on her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice firmer now. David leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. "I've frozen our accounts. Sold the car, too. I figured you wouldn't mind since you seem to have found other arrangements." Melissa froze. Her face was an intricate dance of emotions: confusion, realization, indignation, and then fear. "What are you talking about?" David's jaw clenched, but his voice remained calm. "You can stop pretending. I found the receipts. The late-night charges at the Hyatt, the expensive dinners, the cozy little notes you've been writing to John. I know everything. Melissa's lips parted, but no words came. Her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She looked down at her credit card again, then back at David, searching for some way to salvage the situation. "This is ridiculous," she finally said, her voice shaking. "I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can," David replied, "but you might want to start by explaining why my hard work has been funding your dates with another man." Melissa stammered, but David cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Don't insult my intelligence by denying it. I've seen the evidence, Melissa. The dinners, the hotel stays, the messages. And before you spin some story about, work dinners or misunderstood receipts, let me remind you that I've been documenting everything." For a moment, silence filled the room, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Melissa's shoulders slumped as her bravado drained away. "David," she began softly, her eyes brimming with tears, "I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. Things between us haven't been the same, and I don't." David interrupted, his voice steely. "Don't you dare shift this onto me. If you were unhappy, we could have talked, gone to therapy, done something. But you didn't. You lied. You cheated. You humiliated me." Melissa stepped closer, her hand reaching for his arm, but David stood and stepped back, his expression cold. "What's the plan now, Melissa?" he asked. "Gonna call John and tell him you're broke? That you need him to swoop in and rescue you?" The mention of John's name made Melissa flinch. "I'll fix this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Fulfill your daughter." David laughed, a bitter sound that filled the room. "Fix what? Your betrayal? Your double life? There's nothing to fix, Melissa. It's done. You made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences." Melissa sank into the chair he'd just vacated, her face pale. "I didn't think you'd find out," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I could keep it separate, and it wouldn't affect us." "That's where you're wrong," David replied. "It's already affected us. You shattered the trust we had, and as for keeping it separate, you use my money, my effort, to bankroll your little affair. That's not separate. That's a slap in the face." As the weight of her actions settled on her, Melissa began to cry, her face in her hands. David felt a pang of sadness, but quickly squashed it. He had no room for pity right now, not for her. The weight of her actions settled on him, and he noticed for the first time the footprint that she'd left. "I've already contacted a lawyer," he said, his voice steady. "You'll hear from them soon. And before you even think about trying to claim any part of what we built, remember that I have all the evidence. Every charge, every message. If you want to fight me, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you did." Melissa looked up, her tear-streaked face a picture of despair. "David, please," she whispered. "I'll do anything. Just don't let this destroy us." "There is no us," David replied firmly. "Not anymore. Pack your things. You can stay at John's place or figure something else out. But you're not staying here." Melissa stared at him, her tears falling silently. She realized there was no arguing, no bargaining. David had already made up his mind. It took Lance and a strong arm to break down the gathering darkness. "Okay, we're in here. I'm Melissa." "David." When she finally stood and went upstairs to pack, David stayed where he was, staring at the spot where she had been. His heart ached, but there was a strange sense of liberation, too. He had taken control, and now he would rebuild without her. By the next morning, the silence in David's house was deafening. Melissa's belongings were gone, her suitcase rolling out the door late the previous night. The faint scent of her perfume still lingered, but David knew that would fade in time, just like the wounds she had inflicted. Today wasn't about mourning. Today was about exposure. David sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open and phone in hand. He had spent the early hours meticulously drafting messages to their closest friends and family. Each message was direct but not dramatic, a clear recounting of what had happened. He attached receipts, screenshots of Melissa's messages to John, and a brief explanation of what had happened to him at Wilma's. "I wanted you to hear this from me before rumors started. Melissa's been unfaithful for some time, using our shared resources to fund her affair. I'm taking steps to move forward, but I felt it was important to be honest with you all. Thank you for your support." He hesitated for a moment before hitting send. But once the first message went out, there was no stopping. The responses started rolling in almost immediately from his mother. David, I'm so sorry. We're here for you. Let me know what you need. From his best friend, Greg, man, I can't believe this. She seems so perfect. Call me if you want to talk. And even Melissa's sister, Claire, responded with shock. David, I don't even know what to say. I had no idea. Please let me know how I can help. Somewhere in those messages, David realized just how much support he truly had. The betrayal had felt isolating, but now it was clear he wasn't alone. Now, I went through that experience and it opened my eyes to next, he turned his attention to Melissa's workplace. While David wasn't vindictive by nature, he believed John needed to be held accountable too. Using the evidence he had gathered, David crafted an anonymous email to John's HR department. He attached screenshots of their conversations, expense records showing personal dinners disguised as business meetings, and a note that simply read, "Your employee John has been using company funds and work hours to conduct an affair with a married coworker. I thought you should be aware." David hesitated again before hitting send. It wasn't an easy choice, but he knew it was the right one. Hours later, Claire called him. "David," she began, her voice trembling, "I confronted Melissa. She denied everything at first, but when I told her you had shown me the evidence, she broke down. She's devastated. But she doesn't seem to regret it. It's like she's more upset about being caught." David sighed. "That sounds about right. She wants to talk to you," Claire continued. "She says she needs closure. She's had all the time in the world to come clean," David replied. "Now, I need closure, and I'm finding it by moving on." That evening, David's phone buzzed with a message from Greg. "Check your email," it read. Opening his inbox, David found a forwarded thread. It was from Melissa's work circle, a string of messages where John had been called out in a meeting for his behavior. Someone had leaked David's email. The thread ended with an ominous note from HR. "Effective immediately, John is suspended pending an internal investigation." David felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Actions had consequences, and John was now experiencing his. But the exposure wasn't just about punishing Melissa and John. It was about reclaiming his own narrative. He decided to visit their mutual friends, couples they had vacationed with, attended dinners with, laughed with. At the first house, he sat across from Sarah and Mike, friends they had known for nearly a decade. "I didn't come here to make you choose sides," David explained, "but I want you to know the truth. Melissa betrayed me, and I won't let that be swept under the rug." Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "David, we had no idea. Melissa always talked about how lucky she was to have you. This is unbelievable." "I think she believed her own lies," David said. "But that's over now." By the time he left their home, Sarah had promised to block Melissa from the group chats, and Mike had offered to help David move anything Melissa had left behind. Over the next week, David systematically dismantled the false image Melissa had created. Socially, professionally, even within their families. Her web of deceit was laid bare. Some might have seen his actions as excessive, but David knew better. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Melissa had relied on secrecy and manipulation to maintain her double life. By dragging her lies into the light, David ensured that she could no longer spin her narrative, but exposing her wasn't the end game. It was a step toward closure, a way of clearing the wreckage so he could rebuild. David's dignity wasn't restored by tearing Melissa down. It was restored by reclaiming control over his life and refusing to let her betrayal define him. When the final message was sent and the last conversation had, David looked out the window at the fading sunset. He felt lighter, freer. Melissa might have played him, but she hadn't broken him. The truth was out, and now David could just finally move forward. The days following the exposure were surprisingly quiet. The chaos of confrontation and the rush of revelations had settled, leaving behind a strange, almost peaceful silence. For the first time in years, David felt like he could breathe again. He spent his mornings in the backyard, sipping coffee and staring at the trees that lined the edge of his property. The space felt different now, less a place of shared memories and more a sanctuary for his recovery. It wasn't just about Melissa being gone. It was about finally reclaiming his life. The first major step in his rebuilding process was simple yet profound: reorganizing the house. David walked through each room with fresh eyes, removing traces of Melissa that no longer belonged. Her favorite throw pillows on the couch, the framed photo of their wedding on the mantel, the perfume bottle still sitting on the bathroom counter. All were carefully packed into boxes and stored in the garage. Through all those things, he'd found a bottle of Tang and Teller to help with his memory problems, and above all, had forgotten her dreams and memories about the dog she'd loved as a child. He wasn't ready to throw him away just yet, but he also couldn't stand to see him every day. By the end of the week, his home felt less like a shared space and more like his own. He rearranged furniture, hung new artwork, and even repainted the bedroom. What had once been a suffocating reminder of her betrayal now felt like a blank slate. David also turned his attention to his career, something he realized he had been neglecting while focusing on salvaging a marriage that Melissa had already abandoned in her heart. At the office, he threw himself into new projects, staying late not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The satisfaction of completing a task on his own terms was invigorating, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of control. So the one thing he leaned toward over the years is drinking. Still, the wounds Melissa had inflicted weren't healed overnight. Nights were the hardest. Without her beside him, the bed felt too big, too empty. He would lie awake, replaying moments from their marriage, wondering how he had missed the signs. Some nights, the anger came back, raw and searing. Other nights, it was sadness, a deep ache that settled in his chest. But with each passing day, those moments became less frequent. His friends played a vital role in helping him move forward. Greg invited him over for poker nights. Sarah and Mike dragged him out to brunch, and his sister Anna checked in daily, her no-nonsense attitude a grounding force. "Don't let her take more from you than she already has," Anna told him one evening. "You're better than this." Their words stuck with him. One Saturday, David decided to take another leap forward, reclaiming his social life. He accepted an invitation to a barbecue hosted by his coworker, Elena. It was a small gathering, just a few colleagues and their friends, but it felt monumental to David. At first, he stayed near the edges, nursing a drink and watching the others laugh and mingle. But as the evening wore on, he found himself drawn into conversations. Elena introduced him to her friend Claire, a graphic designer with a sharp wit and a warm smile. They talked for hours about everything from work to travel to their shared love of hiking. For the first time in months, David felt something shift inside him, a spark of hope. He wasn't ready for anything serious, but the simple act of connecting with someone new reminded him that life could still hold joy. The next day, David started a journal, something he hadn't done since college. He filled its pages with thoughts, reflections, and small victories. Made it through the day without feeling angry. Finally deleted Melissa's number. Met someone interesting at the barbecue. See, writing became his therapy, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions that came with starting over. As the weeks turned into months, David noticed the changes in himself. He smiled more often, laughed without forcing it, and looked forward to the future instead of dwelling on the past. The betrayal no longer defined him. It had shaped him, certainly, but it wasn't the whole story. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, David realized he had reached a turning point. Melissa's actions had shattered his world, but in the aftermath, he had rebuilt something stronger. The man who had been blindsided and broken was gone. In his place stood someone resilient, someone who had faced the worst and come out the other side. David finished his drink and went inside, shutting the door on the past and stepping into a future that was entirely his own, feeling just as if he were a brother being offered something for the first time in his life.